Hey everybody, Nick here. Today's video is definitely on the rant side of things and probably more than a little bit contrarian, but I feel really strongly about this. The prevailing sentiment across YouTube and the filmmaking community in general is that cameras are all fantastic, that you can't go wrong with any of these tools and you can make a feature film on any budget mirrorless camera from your local big box store. I come down in a slightly different place, which is that cameras suck. All of them, from the Osmo Pocket 3 to the Alexa 35, they are all woefully buggy, feature-starved, incoherent messes whose greatest triumph is that they even exist at all, though they barely even function, let alone excel. Now, the immediate and obvious retort to this opinion is that great film and content exists, so surely the cameras we have are good enough, right? Only a bad carpenter blames his tools, right? Can't you make a great film on any equipment from an iPhone to an RE? Didn't they make the Creator on the FX3? And of course, all of that is true. My complaint here isn't that cameras are unusable. It's that they could be so much better, and there's really no excuse for them not to be. Let me explain. And quick side note, I think lenses are doing great, and we're getting more and more awesome lens options every day. This is the Zelmus Apollo anamorphic. It is on loan from a colleague, and I'm gonna have some more content about that in particular. I'm so excited to be shooting with this thing. But anyway, back to our scheduled rant. Digital cinema is a combination of hardware and software. The critical hardware that differentiates cameras is the sensor stack, which can include things like optical low-pass filters, backside illumination, dual-gain output circuitry, active cooling. It's a whole group of technologies ultimately designed to measure photons of light and report them back to the computational side of the camera. And despite what the industry wants you to believe every 12 to 18 months, progress on sensor technology is very, very slow. The original Arri Alexa was introduced in April 2010. That's nearly 15 years ago. And it came with a sensor called the Alev 3. And today, knocking on the door of 2025, the current most popular cinema cameras are the Alexa Mini and the Alexa Mini LF, which use the exact same Alev 3 sensor, almost everything about which is basically unchanged in the last 15 years. And guess what? That sensor still outperforms every other sensor on the market, except the one Arri themselves launched inside the Alexa 35, aptly named the Alev 4. There are some close calls. Red's VistaVision sensor in the V-Raptor and V-Raptor X are actually pretty close in terms of latitude and dynamic range, and it actually sees into shadows better than Alev 3. The new Blackmagic Ursa Cine 12K is pretty close as well. But there's nothing that even comes close to the Alev 4, which was developed sometime in 2020. So there's a lot of room for the industry to catch up there. Only Arri seems to really be pushing the idea of improving dynamic range, or maybe due to the patents they're sitting on, they've, defended a position where they remain the best game in town. But patents have a life of 20 years at the maximum, so there's no reason we can't all expect to see Alev 3 levels of dynamic range by the end of the decade in every true cinema camera out there. Sure, maybe not in tiny mirrorless cameras, but in any camera body that's 3 pounds or more, there's enough room for active cooling, DGO circuitry, and 14 stops of dynamic range at signal-to-noise ratio of 2. By 2030, I don't want to see cameras still reporting just 12 clean stops. That kind of sucks, and I don't want to see it anymore. Camera hardware is, of course, not limited to the sensor, but the rest of the critical hardware is basically all about data movement and processing. How many ones and zeros can you move around, manipulate, and then record to media, and how fast can you do that? So improvements in bandwidth, communication protocols, precision silicon manufacturing, they've all helped in this regard over time. We can now easily record 120 frames per second in high-quality 4K, even in tiny consumer mirrorless cameras. That's nice. Honestly, that part of the equation doesn't suck at all. But the camera industry has had little to do with this improvement. They've just borrowed it from the wider tech sector at large. And when you look at the wider production ecosystem, things get bad in a hurry. At the top end, most cinema cameras are like NASA projects. They're unbelievably complex, convoluted, nothing is straightforward. You want to use the industry's flagship Alexa Mini LF? You need to connect multiple wires just to power the thing on and look through the viewfinder. Most production setups are this absolute rat's nest of cables, plates, adapters, cobbled together so haphazardly. The closest thing we have to an elegant and integrated solution is the Ronin 4D. And if that camera gets a next generation upgrade, it could be pretty amazing. But in its current form, it's so limited in terms of lens choice, the slow rolling shutter, and its acceptable but not dazzling dynamic range. It's a great stab at the idea of vertical integration, but I'm not the first person to say that it's a little bit half-baked. And yes, I'm including the newer 8K version as well in that comment. The Red V-Raptor X is, in my opinion, the best all-around cinema camera there is right now. It has plenty of dynamic range, especially in the shadows. It has great integration with the small HD monitor, and without too much fuss, you can build out an absolutely smoking setup. The only thing that kind of sucks here is the size, the weight, the cost. Those are the chief drawbacks, as well as the slightly buggy operating system, the slow startup time, which means you aren't going to be whipping it out for a quick moment that suddenly occurs. But when you know you're going to film something important and you take the time to set it up, it's just gorgeous footage. The Komodo X is also fantastic, basically half of everything the V-Raptor is, half the size, half the weight, less than half the cost, half the light gathering ability, half the sensor real estate. But what Red doesn't have going for it is autofocus. Yes, they can technically do it, but it sucks. A hypothetical camera that shoots like the V-Raptor X, but at the size and the weight of a Komodo X, with the startup time and autofocus performance of a Sony A9 III, that would be killer. And we have all the technology to build such a camera, but it obviously doesn't exist. Side note, at this point, it's also important to mention the critical hardware innovation of stabilization, which can be accomplished at the micro scale with a stabilized sensor, but more importantly at the macro scale with things like gimbals, Steadicams, stabilized heads, and the like. That's one thing the Ronin 4D integrates so beautifully, including Z-axis stabilization. These technologies have empowered filmmakers to tell stories in entirely new ways and really helped the art form as a whole to blossom. But it's generally not a part of the camera itself, which is kind of what I'm talking about here. So that's hardware at a glance. What about the software side of digital cinema? That is so much worse. A few days ago, Sony announced that they have a roadmap to improve the firmware in most of their cinema cameras from the FX3 up to the Venice, but these upgrades are going to take something like 15 months to fully roll out. Why? Why? These are such minor things. This code could be written in a week if you really wanted to. And more broadly, there's no reason why every consumer mirrorless camera on the market can't have something like shutter angle built in. If we can have custom date, time, and file name built in to the settings of a $900 big box special, there's no reason we can't add shutter angle and things like codec, frame rate, white balance, audio routing into every camera out there. We have the hardware and the computational power sufficient to do whatever we want with these cameras. So why are they all so limited? Look at the Canon R5C. When the original R5 was launched, Canon wanted it to be a sort of flagship in the stills/cinema hybrid space, but people didn't understand how heat works, they pushed the camera too hard, and then thought that the camera had overheating problems. So Canon slapped a fan on the back of it, added its CinemaLine user interface, and launched the R5C, a camera that turned out to be hugely successful and was relatively easy for Canon to produce. So why doesn't every Canon stills camera offer the cinema interface? There's so much to like there. Little things like the ability to simultaneously view on the rear LCD and the HDMI output without blackout, even when switching between shooting and playback modes. The R5C does it, but no other handheld mirrorless camera from Canon or Sony does it. All of the stills cameras either black out the LCD or the HDMI during playback and have several seconds of blackout between switching between those modes. That's like one of a couple of dozen usability problems with these little cameras, which are 100% fixable with a little software finesse and have no reason to exist. So what's the fix more broadly? What do we need in the next generation of cinema cameras? Well, the list is long, detailed, and more vast than I can cover in the scope of a single video like this, but if I were king for a day, in broad strokes, here's what I think we need in the cinema world going forward. Number one, standardize the connections. Let's just make everything work on USB-C. That interface can now handle up to 240 watts in a single cable, which is more than enough for any major cinema camera rig. It has the bandwidth to push more data than we'll ever need in the cinema space, so let's just make everything use that one connector. Power, video, audio, wireless transmission. Just put 5 USB-C ports on every camera and make it so that each one can handle any or all of the functions of the camera. And no more custom pinouts like we see on the Red and the DJI components. The standard is already fine as it is. We can even settle on a locking system or a friction fit like the Core Swix new batteries. This would let us do away with custom power cables, HDMI, SDI, BNC connectors with their iffy power protocols, LEMO ports, custom viewfinder and monitor connections, all of it, just USB-C everywhere, every camera. Number 2, improve the ergonomics. We have these two worlds, the stills world and the cinema world, and use cases for each one are blending more and more every day, but the ergonomics have stayed really separate. You either have a cinema camera designed for tripod mounts, shoulder mounts, and that kind of workflow, and then you have stills cameras designed to be held right in front of your face. But if you want to take a stills camera and use it like a cinema camera, it's a bit of an ergonomic and rigging nightmare. You put on a battery and now the LCD's blocked. I love the Sony A9 III, which is filming me right now. It works really well in certain situations and it can take fantastic stills photos. But when I want to use it for video, it's nice to have side handles and a different placement for the monitor. But I can't use the LCD monitor anywhere except the back. I've been contemplating trying to re-rig the LCD itself so I can, maybe put it on top of the camera. And you might say, hey, I'm basically describing something like the FX6 or the Canon C400, but then I lose both the excellent stills functionality and the incredible stripped down portability of a smaller camera, both of which I get in the A9 III and I really appreciate from time to time. So my point is we need to improve how these stills cameras function. Allow us to detach the LCD and put it on top of the camera if we want. Maybe use a USB-C connection for it. Give us 5-inch screens on the back like the Blackmagic Pocket camera did. Put mounting points all over the camera like the FX3 did, but even for little stills cameras because it's really easy to manufacture and it makes life so much easier. These things really wouldn't increase the unit cost of the camera from a manufacturing perspective, but they would make life so much better for the end users. Number 3, this is the big one. Fix your software. This is about usability, but also about efficiency. There's no reason a camera should take 45 seconds to boot. If a Canon R5C can boot in 4 seconds and it records 8K RAW, there's no reason a Red can't boot that fast too. The Red also requires a reboot when you switch from RAW to compressed formats like ProRes, and yet the tiny R5C doesn't require that reboot. That makes no sense to me. Similarly, every camera should have easy access to all the settings we need, and in simple and straightforward ways. Most true cinema cameras are okay in terms of their interface, but they could all take a page out of Blackmagic or DJI's books in terms of clear and efficient interfaces. Hybrid stills cameras, their interfaces are garbage for the most part. Settings are horribly buried, poorly named, difficult to customize. Video outs are horribly managed and they make the user experience just so janky and unwieldy. If I want to use a mirrorless camera with a monitor on top, I either compromise access to the rear LCD by putting a battery there, or I keep that access, but now I compromise a consistent power setup requiring multiple batteries. I lose easy touch focus, and even if a solution like the Atomos Shinobi 2 brings it back, I still lose easy access to playback controls. The Sony A9 III doesn't let you scrub through footage with a finger. It makes me go crazy, like it's maddening. If I want to review footage carefully and like scrub through slowly or frame by frame, I can do that on the Red, I can do that on Canon, can't do it on Sony. Hey, maybe they'll make a software fix, it's coming in 2035. There's no reason to limit cameras artificially just for product differentiation. I think that far too often someone on the corporate side of these camera companies looks at their lineup and wants to ensure that there are clear steps between each of their products at a software level to ensure that there remain reasons for the customer to upgrade over time. I speculate that they don't want to put their best software in their cheapest camera so that they retain customers at every price bracket. I think that rather than worry about cannibalization, they should worry about market share. The Canon R5C is a good example of what you can do if you just give the pro-level software to the consumer-level camera. But even that camera has its limits and drawbacks, like why does the R5C have to shut off when you open the battery door? And why won't you let people power the camera with dummy batteries? It's just artificial restrictions that have no real purpose except to frustrate people. Sony's cameras do have a relatively broad array of cinema-level controls, even in the stills camera software, but things like the HDMI output management still make me a little bit crazy, as I mentioned before. That brings me to one more point about the software side. We need reliable communication of both camera control and the camera's video feed, both wired and wireless. Currently, the best example of this is probably Sony. Their Camera Control app and third-party Monitor Plus app do a great job of allowing control via smartphone devices, but there are always weird bugs here and there. Like, for example, if you use those apps and you switch from shooting to playback modes, the screen blacks out. Maybe the industry just needs to license out Teradek's patent on zero delay transmission and just integrate it into every camera. They all have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth radios, just use those for a good connection on every camera. let us control the camera easily. Let third-party hardware control the focus motors inside of your autofocus lenses so that you can easily pull focus without additional motors or hardware. Just rewrite the code a little bit and we can get so much more out of the exact same hardware. And number 4, let's please improve dynamic range, really. 11 stops, 11 clean stops is barely passable. 14 stops is quite nice. I absolutely lust after the 15 plus clean stops inside the Alexa 35. But if we could get to like 20 stops, it would really save a lot of time not having to worry about exact perfect exposure. It would be like what 32-bit audio has done for sound recording. With 32-bit recording, you no longer have to worry about setting gain. You still need proper technique, and in the video setting, you'd still need to light and compose your scene properly, but you wouldn't have to worry about perfect exposure. Just look through the monitor, and as long as things seem okay, you're definitely not going to clip. It's possible that we're already there with the Alexa 35. I've never used one. I would love to see a full-frame version of the Alive 4 sensor, maybe one day. I love cameras. I love shooting. Movies are my favorite art form. Getting to experiment with this stuff is literally a dream come true for me. I think it's amazing that we have these tools. It's amazing what we can do with them. When I say that cameras suck, I don't mean they aren't worth using. I mean that they pale in comparison to what they could be if these companies cared to realize their full potential. We have all the pieces we need to make truly amazing equipment, and the more of us there are demanding it, the more likely that could come to pass. Does any of this strike a chord with you, or do you think I'm just an old man telling the kids to get off my lawn? I'm sure you'll let me know in the comments. Anyway, that's going to be all for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.